really appreciate the opportunity to share a discussion with everyone today. And I just love that I follow Chris, because he he talked about just about everything that I would want to talk about. So there's a lot of synergy between what's already been discussed. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to do a ridiculous race through a lot of big things, more just to give a feel of some issues. And I guess when I approached this, I was thinking of it through the prism of what I think are often untold stories. And I'll come back a bit more to what I mean by that. So, but just for people that don't know, I'm associated with an organisation called Australia Remade. And what we're trying to do is very much along the lines of what Chris was talking about, promote a vision for the country, but alongside the vision, trying to also do systems change, analysis to see how you're actually going to change the drivers that actually realise that vision. And what we have learned, I think, through a process of just learning, we certainly didn't set out with this expectation, is that to remake, you first need to unravel. And so we spend quite a lot of time trying to just understand. And so in a way, what we're drawn to is the stories of what's unknown or ill-defined, unspoken, unnoticed, misunderstood, untold. What is it that sits in the background that actually creates the environment in which we're operating, often holds us here and prevents us from moving to the vision that we would like to see realised. And so we talk a lot about transformation and remaking, but we've appreciated that without an analysis around system change, that's very difficult to really sort of realise. And so we have this lovely quote from Millie, who's actually from Australia Remade and sitting on this call today and talking later this afternoon, about system change, because we've actually struggled with what the hell a system is, or systems. And so we talk about these strangely invisible things that seem impenetrable and inevitable, but actually they're made by people and therefore can be changed. So it's really important that we don't get captured by the mystique or seemingly naturalness of these things. So actually unravelling is important to creating change. And I want to use this quote. It actually has a much bigger meaning, but just for the purpose of today. In the cause of silence, each of us draws the face of our own fear of contempt, censure, judgment. There are so many silences to be broken. And I put this here because one of the issues that we talk a lot about at Australia Remade when we're thinking about unravelling is the fact that none of us are experts. We don't work in academia, we don't have scores of researchers, we're just practitioners coming at this to try and unravel things. And so we come at it with a fair level of vulnerability and to exposure, to critique, to challenge, and indeed to censure. So what we're trying to do is create an open space and be more forgiving of each other when we're trying to grapple with these really big issues, and not feel like we've got to know it all, or we don't have to know all the latest theories or be experts, but try to unravel in ways that build community ownership around analysis. So I just want to quickly touch on three stories, or as examples about how untold stories really shape our world and shape or inhibit our capacity to change that world. And the first is, Chris has particularly touched on, and that is the political movement that dared not speak its own name. And I think there's a lot can be said about neoliberalism, or neoliberal capitalism, as Chris referred to it. I think for me, one of the most interesting little side stories is the fact that for many, many years, the proponents of those set of theories, ideology, ideas, refused to actually name it or put it out there as a cohesive set of ideas. Even the notion of the Mount Pelerin Society was quite deliberately obscure, so it didn't do anything but obfuscate. And part of that was there's a whole range of reasons as to why, but one in particular, I think, was the very real intention to try and make these philosophies and these sort of ideas seem as if they're just entirely natural and not contrived, and not part of any conspiracy, not part of any construct. And so in that sense, it was very clever. And there's just a little graph, there's various versions of this that are interesting, but you look at this and it's from 1935 to more recent times, and you'll see that although neoliberalism really started to gain some, or its ideas started to gain some currency in the 70s and particularly the 80s and 90s, you see that it was very little reference to it as a notion until much more recently. And now the debate that's interesting that is being had is whether the word is overused, overextended, whatever. And so there's a whole other debate about it, but interesting that they were able to just avoid naming the issue. And so I think that is a really powerful story of not telling. And clearly associated with neoliberalism, there's a whole lot of what would be called, sorry, I've lost someone. Okay, essentially double truths, and I won't go into all of these. I think we know them all by now, but you know, Tina, there is no alternative. That was a very powerful story that was told, and basically talk about take away your agency or capacity to resist or change or fight for something better or different. Trickle down, we know about freedom, deregulation, the misnomer of both of those, freedom for who and what, freedom for money and capital, not for people, and deregulation, which again was a misnomer, choice, free market. So all of these had a particular story in the public arena, but actually had a whole other story behind them that took a long time to come out. So as I say, I'm just going to race through these, but more just to give a taste of what I guess I'm calling sort of the untold stories that are critical to expose if we're going to create change. The second is a little piece of work that we did a while ago, and this is about a statement from Trump. This was about their so-called Tax and Jobs Act in 2017 that delivered massive tax cuts, particularly to corporate America. And I think that what we did there was we basically did what Chris was talking about. We picked a thread and just unravelled and looked where it took us. And so we started by a little project of inquiry around this notion of buybacks. I'd never heard of buybacks. I just saw a story in a paper where Frydenberg was berating companies for being lazy and buying back their shares with excess funds as opposed to investing it in new capital, or, you know, etc. And I thought, oh, it's unusual for a Liberal Prime Minister to have a go at corporations. So what's the story? And I must admit, I didn't really know much about buybacks. So, and what became clear was that a whole story unravelled. So buybacks are essentially when companies can use their earnings to essentially buy back their own company's shares, and in so doing, it actually artificially inflates the share price because the volume is restricted. They've not actually added any value to the corporation other than the scarcity of the shares, and so the share price goes up. There's a one-off windfall to shareholders, but what it means is that essentially those corporations are being denuded of funds. They've got less capacity to invest in people, product, innovation, etc. And what we saw was that the tax cuts basically, so buybacks were the siphon essentially in the US. Tax cuts came into the corporation and then went so out of the public purse into the corporation, and through the buyback schemes and dividends, but particularly buybacks, went into shareholder pockets. And so it was the great devouring of the public purse into not just private pockets, but 20%, the top 20% of US income earners hold something like 80% of the shares. So it was a direct wealth transfer from public to the elite in terms of the private. And part of thinking about buybacks was, well, what's the rationale for this beyond just, you know, greed and wealth transfer? And there's a sort of a logic in economic principle about agency theory and about you don't trust the CEO to really have the interests at heart unless you tie their success to the success of the corporation. So you see this explosion over the last few decades of CEO pay being aligned to return on the share price. And so you see them you know, now most CEO pay packets are at least 50% or more in shares and various related bonuses and payments. So the drive for this buyback was partly by the aggressive investors like hedge funds and that wanted quick returns, and in and out investors as opposed to long-term investors looking for quality investments, but also the CEO remuneration push. And what you see is this massive wealth or income increase for CEOs, and that's where you start to see the big income divide, particularly in the US. Well, reflected worldwide, but exacerbated there. And part of that was driven by this, another sort of hidden story, if you like. Some of you may know all of this, but I guess it was in the unravelling that we were constantly shocked at our naivety at not thinking about some of these things. But this notion that shareholder primacy was one of the key drivers, and that this notion that you know, Friedman had, that there's only one social responsibility business, and it's to increase its profits and to return those to shareholders. And so it's entirely around a shareholder perspective, not a stakeholder perspective. And you know, Lasnik talks about maximisation of shareholder value basically is a predatory value extraction as opposed to a value adding activity, and essentially just transfers wealth. And the thing about shareholder primacy is that actually the laws in most, you know, US and here essentially are about corporation, or, you know, being responsible to corporations, not to the shareholder. So it's it's a myth that's been built up, not based in specific law. And in fact, you're now seeing some shifts in this in the US. But again, it was just the great con that the shareholder was the only beneficiary and should therefore get all the gain, as opposed to stakeholders, particularly workers, who got totally dudded in this period. And so also what we found is that those companies with the biggest buybacks actually performed least well, they were the least efficient, they did the least investment, they had the oldest capital stock, etc. So, you know, it was basically overall, you know, starting with this little story about buybacks, unravelling this whole litany of sins, sort of started to unpack what was happening in the economy that was helping to explain the big shifts in income and wealth polarisation. And just, you know, the result was that, you know, one, that the richest did much better, but also what we saw, I think, in this so-called tax and jobs package, I think something like 60% or more of the benefit went to shareholders, 8% went to workers. And so when, you know, these stories are really important to understand, so that when in Australia we've had the debate in the last few years about reducing corporate taxes, because that will lead to greater investment and, you know, better productivity, and, you know, it's just not borne out by the experience of the US, that basically just saw money totally translate into individual wealthy shareholder pockets. So the third story is, and I'm sorry none of these are particularly cheery stories, the third story is some work we've been doing more recently to try and, as the notion of neoliberalism is useful, but it doesn't entirely give us a lot of detail. And so we've been trying to unpack that and sort of where that system is morphing to, because it's in transition, we believe. And so trying to understand what are the sort of the weak points, the new points, the boundaries. And so what are the new values and different types of drivers that we need to understand? And, you know, we can't, as Naomi Klein insists on us, you know, we just can't say no. We can't just look at the manifestations of problems. We can't just operate in silos and isolate the issue of inequality from climate, from racism, from whatever the issue. There's the connection. So where does that come and how does it operate? And we can't just rest with a vision. So, you know, again, and this reflects some of the work on previous slides of Chris's, you know, we started to unpack what are some of the problematic drivers from that neoliberal sort of period. And so it is about denuding the state, it's about delegitimizing anything public, it's about deregulating markets, but re-regulating workers and other public sort of spheres of potential agency. It's about oh, sorry, I'm not sure I demonopolise it, and it's about decollectivising people. So, and it's actually about, ironically, it's about so-called freeing up the market, but actually leading towards quite strong oligopolistic outcomes. And again, I think it's worth saying this is the story we don't often talk about. And so again, it's great hearing Chris's work and what others are doing. But the real hidden story in all of this is we often talk about the machinery of difference between what is or what's problematic and what we'd like. But actually central to these competing stories are the values that drive us. And we don't talk enough, particularly on our side of politics, about those values and what's a difference there. It's about competition versus cooperation, well-being, not economic growth as our key progress measure, power shared, not concentrated, collective over individualism, sharing and respect for nature, not exploitation. So some of the things that have already been spoken of previously. And so in that work, we came up with trying to think about how do we respond then? How do we start to think about when people say, oh, well, what we need is a UBI, or when people say we need to control political funding, how do we analyse those initiatives in the sort of framework of response, and are these things sufficient? Are they going to give us a real sense of going to the root causes, or are they always going to be playing catch up by dealing with manifestations of problems? And so we started to identify that there are actually 5 Ds that we've talked about. We want to demarketise, so we want to re-promote public good and areas of life in the environment, the world that we don't want to be determined by market values. So how do we carve that out, identify, support and protect and enhance? Decarbonise, obviously, and the sort of the broader notions around sustainability plus, as Chris mentioned. We want to democratise, and for us, democratise is very much about participation. Decolonise and demonopolise, it's in the right place now. You can't have democracy, you can't attack inequality while ever you have polarisation and concentration of wealth and power. And so how do you start to unpack those things? So it is really all about trying to learn how to unravel, because once you've got those sorts of areas that you've identified, you can then start to think about strategies, policies, discussions that flow to say, well, what does demonopolise mean in the Australian context when we don't really have that sort of conversation going on, and particularly when the whole antitrust type debate got, hijacked, and it's a whole other story, and Tim Wu's got some great stories about that. But, we lost that debate over the last 50 years. How do you restart it or rethink it? So the unravelling will give us elements of a new agenda to start thinking about. And just to finish, I've got 2 seconds. I went back to a book called, it's Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. And I'll just stop that so you're not looking at the screen. Because I actually and I thought there was a lovely quote. He talks about the history of any country presented as the history of a family conceals fierce conflicts of interest, sometimes exploding, most often repressed, between conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, dominators and dominated in race and sex. And in such a world of conflict, a world of victims and executioners, it is the job of thinking people, as Albert Camus suggested, not to be on the side of the executioners. And so a bit of a dramatic finish, but I just thought that in a way, often the story, and particularly the story of neoliberalism, has been the story of the victors, those that have done the best, those that have controlled the power and the wealth. And so the untold stories and the unravelling is really critical if we're to actually not be silent in the face of the executioner.